the Farbrengen, and that was downstairs, a very interesting Farbrengen. And the most recent one, obviously, and I think Rabbi Willem was there, I was there, it was in the end of Tufshin Mem Zayin, and that was actually the same, if I remember correctly. For some reason, I think it was like this year's Kviyas. Not all, the whole year wasn't the same. That only happened in Tufshin Chafei and Tufshin Nun Beis, but I believe the day of Rosh Hashanah was because, if I remember correctly, Rosh Hashanah was Sunday. It might have been Monday. I don't have the calendar in front of me this moment. But the point is that the Rebbe then said at the end, said on Shabbos that he would farbring again Motzei Shabbos, and at the end of that farbringing, the Rebbe also said that maybe the Gaboyim will announce that Slichus will be a little bit later tomorrow. And he said, we're not dealing here with a clock; we're dealing with live people. So there was always a Farbrengen. The reason why I bring that in here is because the Farbrengen started after the Sudas ended in 770. And that's also not a matter of speculation of why, but a statement of fact. So going back to Rosh Hashanah, after the Sudas, the Rebbe went home. After Tavshin Lamed Aleph, the Rebbe went home after Ma'ariv. The Rebbe would come back to 770 in the morning of Rosh Hashanah, between 7 and 8 o'clock. The davening didn't start till 10 o'clock. And at that time, Bochum already went on Mivtza Shofar, the shofar blowing. They didn't do in the afternoon. The davening ended first at about 3 o'clock. And just to tell you what, where, when, and with the sunset being 6 or 7, the Mivtza Shofar began about 5, 6 in the morning. Bochum already started walking to hospitals so that they would get back by the davening at about 10 or whatever it was. So that's when the Mivtzoyim was. It was the morning run. Nevertheless, of course, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but 770 was very packed on Rosh Hashanah in order to hear the Rebbe's Tkiyas. And even today there's over 50 shuls in Crown Heights. And in many years, in those years, there were 20, 30 some odd, whatever it was, shuls in Crown Heights. But all of them on Rosh Hashanah, or shall I say the vast majority of them, would get up to shofar blowing, and then they would make a break. And they would all go to 770. All the members of all the other minyanim would walk to 770 to hear the Rebbe's shofar blowing. And after shofar blowing, they would all walk back. They wouldn't talk. You're not supposed to talk then. Walk back to their shuls and start from Musaf. I just wanted to point out because that was a time where everybody came, even the minyanim that were davening in other shuls. So it's well known, and I'm sure everyone has read about it. I just want to talk very briefly about the Rebbe's blowing shofar. The Rebbe came in the morning. The Rebbe came in with several sfarim, including his regular siddur, a machzer for Rosh Hashanah Kippur, a special machzer that had the Kabbalistic Kavanis in it, called the Siddur HaArizal, also the Siddur Imdach, the Siddur with the Chassidus of the Alter Rebbe. So he had those 4 sfarim with him. Plus he had a big scarf that contained in it the shofris, and the mazkirim, the secretaries, were holding packages made of brown wrapped paper. And the best way that I like to describe it is it looks like about 2 pounds of matzah, maybe a little bit bigger, in the brown paper with the string around it, like you would get in the matzah bakery if it's not in a box. That's what those packages look like. It's commonly said that those are panim. And I don't want to dispute that here, but if it's the panim, it certainly wasn't all the panim, because physically, the amount of envelopes that the Rebbe got, even if there was a compactor or shredder, which they weren't getting shredded, they could not fit into those envelopes. Additionally, there were sometimes nice lumps sticking out from those bags, from those things, and some people speculate that there might have been also objects of other Rabbeim that the Rebbe brought along with him, and maybe a representation of panim, because it certainly could not have been, unless the Rebbe made a miracle and he was able to include all of the panim into those 3 or 4 packages. But that doesn't, the Rebbe didn't do open things like that, although What do I know? Nevertheless, there was a table placed next to the Rebbe's tender for those panim, for those packages to be stored. And when the Rebbe went up, the first day the Rebbe went up, when he was called for maftir, because the Rebbe always had maftir, except for the morning of Tisha B'Av, and for the most part, although there was an exception to that rule too, and for the morning of Yom Kippur. Otherwise, the Rebbe always had maftir. Also, the morning of Simchas Torah, the Rebbe did not have maftir, but all the other times he did. And when he went up from after, the secretaries also went up and brought those packages up to the bima, and the Rebbe went up with that whole stack of books, the 4 or 5 Sfarim. And actually, in the last 4 years, I had the privilege to be standing exactly in the row where the Rebbe would pass by. So I would take as best look possible as I could and try to gather in what I could see. I actually saw the Rebbe, the scarf, the red scarf that the Rebbe used to bring that was from other Rabbeim, another scarf. I did actually see several things in those few moments that the Rebbe walked by our little, what we used to call the structure that we used to stand on by Pekiyas. When the Rebbe went up, so after the second day, the Rebbe went up before Maftir, a little bit before, because the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe said Kaddish for his sister-in-law, the Rebbetzin Shena, who perished in Treblinka, and the Yartzeit was the second day of Rosh Hashanah. So the Rebbe would already go up after the Torah reading. So when they finished, when you would hear the Balkarish to finish, suddenly, because that's when the big pushing started. So before the last person even said the bracha, otherwise you would start the maybe towards the end of the Kaddish. The Rebbe went up, and it became very solemn at that moment. And after the maftir, of course, the pushing and it was packed is beyond what description. I remember sometimes people would come back late from Mivtzoyim, but there were the first 8, 9, 10 rows had what was called Mekoyim Kfuyim, places that were already they were inherited one from the other, and whatever it was actually set out who would be in every row. And every row there was the first 8 to 10 rows, and then it was, let's say, 8 across, and this is just directly in front of the beam, really 10 across. And let's say the person in the 6th row or the 5th row, and he was number 4 across, and he came in because he walked from a hospital. He walked now 2 hours. He just walked, he left 5 in the morning, and the guy walked 2 hours each direction and stayed at the hospital for an hour. Rule Shafer came in, and whatever, huffing and puffing at about 11 o'clock, whatever it was, and he had to get into his place. Sometimes the only way for him to get in was literally to walk on the shoulders of people, and then even when he wedged in his feet into the place, he had to really, it was very hard till he was able to fall in with his body weight into that spot, and this is with the guys on the bottom trying to push and let him in. And this is just a little, and once in a while it got, obviously, there was a big air conditioning in 770. Every once in a while a big cloud would rise just from the condensation of what was going on there. This is all Marach Hitzoinis, the outward view, but from the outward you can get into the inward to see what was happening at this awesome site. And the Rebbe went, and when he got up there, and I don't have the siddur here in front of me, but we're not going to go into every diuk of Tkiyas now, but I just want to tell you the general thing. The Rebbe, it was like a fire. The Rebbe looked like a fire at that moment. There was his face was not somber, not solemn, and not awesome. It was all of that all together at once, and he would set up the things on the bima, which was empty of anything else, and he had those 4 sforim that I told you about in the package of shofars, and 3 or 4 packages of panim, and he would just set them up just how he wanted it. The packages in one corner, another corner, and he would sort of maneuver it so it shouldn't block people. In certain years, in the early Lameds, late Chavs, the Rebbe wanted that the Yidden who just came out of Russia should be standing up with him on the bima at Tkiyas, and several others he requested to join him there. He wanted them to be with him. And then the Rebbe would do something that he didn't do the rest of the year. He would pull up his whole talis, and sort of cover the corners, both front corners of the bima. That's how big it was, and he pulled it out not only over his head, but it covered those two corners, those who, like the corner borders, with those two packages, and then the Rebbe would put his head down. And those who were very close sometimes say they even heard the Rebbe singing a niggin then, a niggin of Dveikus, a special niggin. I personally couldn't hear that because I was always in the about 9 rows back, but I was in the middle, in the place where I could see, standing on that structure that I told you about earlier. So I was able to see the tkiyas very well, but I couldn't hear such a nuance, especially with the commotion. But then when the Rebbe would stay there for maybe 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 8 minutes, depending on whatever the Rebbe had to do, the Rebbe's things. Afterwards, the Rebbe would get up suddenly, and then he would put back the talis. So it would take a moment, but he would straighten it back out so that it was like a talis, like it would normally be. And then the Rebbe would open the sit and say, Lam natseyach livnei keirach mizmeir. And then it would start the 7 times that you say the kapitel Tilim. And then the Rebbe would go through the psukim, and each pasuk, when he said it in a certain tune. Koili Shima, right? Mina Meitzar. We start with Mina Meitzar, etc., and go through all the psukim and the brachas, and then the Rebbe would take out. Sometimes the Rebbe would touch one shofar, take it, put it down. I remember in the later years the Rebbe touched, we pick it up for a second, put it down. So maybe he did that obviously precisely, and then he took the shofar that he was blowing with. Maybe he was touching. He had a shofar there from the Tzemach Tzedek. He had a shofar from his father. He had a couple of other shofars there. For the most part, there was usually 4. Maybe there was times another one. But the Rebbe, for the most part, he used to hold the shofar in the right hand, and the Rebbe also had a grimace on his face when he blew the tkiyas. In addition to all of the ruchnis, the fire that you saw, and the redness, and nevertheless the Rebbe grimaced when he blew the tkiyas, and usually he held it only with one hand. Sometimes he put the second hand also next to his mouth, and usually it was really usually at first a very high pitched note, and sometimes it was hard, and you heard a few of those high pitched notes still, and. There were many stories through the years. It didn't go easy. It went easy, whatever it is, and that's the whole union of Rebbe blowing shofar. But then afterwards, usually the tkiyas were quite crystally clear, as you may hear in tkiyas. The Rebbe's shvarim was like that. I know a lot of people have tried to describe it, but that's how it sounded. And the Rebbe's teruah, I want to mention another thing, because we counted, and if you'll see from different reshimas, different diaries that were written, you'll see that the Rebbe, it says he wrote this time 47, this time 49, this time 46, and we used to argue because we used to count how many times he blew on a teruah. But I want to add that the Rebbe's teruah was really a little bit slower than most. So the Rebbe's teruah was it wasn't it was and it used to go up and down. So it was easier to count, and usually it was in the high 40s range of the teruah. There was one year that I remember that it was very hard to keep track, because the Rebbe went back on certain Sdorim, and I remember we didn't know I would believe that was Tov Shenun. We didn't know what the Rebbe was even up to, but everyone listened, and that's it. The Rebbe blew. He started over, he started again, he started Tkiyah, Shvarim Truah, again a Tkiyah, and then afterwards the Rebbe said the Psukim, and that pasuk that I mentioned earlier, the Rebbe would say, Asherei ha'am yedei seruah Hashem beir ponecha yehaleichun. And then, as he said in the subsequent psukim, he went up in a higher pitch each time. Kisiferes uzamei, like that, he'd go higher and higher. Shimcha yigilun kol hayem, etc. And then the Rebbe would give the makri the one who would point in the siddur was Rabbi Tenenbaum, who would blow the shofar during the Chazar Sashatz. And two more interesting pieces here. One was that the Rebbe, when he got back, and it says at school in Sfarim, that you should see the face of the Baal Tekeya. The Rebbe also said, the Rebbe mentioned this, that one of the things of the Baal Tekeya is that his face should be red. And always, especially the Kiyah Gdoila, the Rebbe's face was very red in the end, and the Rebbe blew until there was no more breath. That's how he blew until there was nothing, until he ran out of breath. And then the Rebbe would go back to his place, and he would turn around. There was also a big pushing and jumping up and down, but the Rebbe would get to his place and turn around in the same direction as he turned around to Boyev Shalom, which was left to right, and he would do it slowly, and he would look around everywhere through the whole 770. Everyone tried to at least get a glimpse of the Rebbe's face, the Rebbe's holy face at that moment, and that's a skula for many things. And then the other thing where people used to, was an interesting thing to see, was the Rebbe would fall koidim, like a 30-year-old man. At koidim, when it was time to bow down, the Rebbe would just move back a little bit. The Rebbe would very quickly go down on his knee and this, and he would jump up. Very interesting to see. The rest of the Rebbe went to Tashlich the first day. That was by 770. The Rebbe he just went out with his siddur, came to the Tashlich, read the prayer. He shuckled off his tzitzis and walked back. There was no people didn't stand in the chutzah, but you could stand around. You could see how the Rebbe said Tashlich. Then there was a farbrengen at the end of the second day, Rosh Hashanah, where in this farbrengen was the mimer. The mimer was called the mimer of Binyan HaMalchus. It always spoke of the Rosh Hashanah and of the sovereignty, and according to Chassidus, how we understand God giving life to the world, etc. Later years that he's saying the Negunim of the Rabbeim. Then it wasn't a very long farbrengen Rosh Hashanah for the most part, and after that farbrengen the Rebbe washed before, so there was benching and Ma'ariv and Kosher Bracha, and the Rebbe gave Kosher Bracha after Rosh Hashanah. So that's just a short synopsis of Rosh Hashanah. What I wanted to say is that the Rebbe gave Kosher Bracha for several hours. The Rebbe would stand and give out wine afterwards. What I wanted to say is that the Rebbe said, and it's in a Farbrengen, the Rebbe said in Tov Shemem Hey, he spoke about the fact that after the Frierdiker Rebbe's Histalkus and Tov Shin Yud, the Rebbe said he's more active. The Frierdiker Rebbe, nevertheless, is more alive and more active than he was. So, if we just want to, all of these things that I described, we have today on Rosh Hashanah. Each and every piece of it. And now is not the time or place to go into this Ba'ariches. Maybe at Chassidus Vabrengen we could talk about it more. But the bottom line is that each and every chassid who learns the Rebbe's Torah and concentrates on what the Rebbe's minhagim are and what the Rebbe's truths are and does what the Rebbe asked of him, gets every one of these hashpoyas, each one of these things that we described, the farbrengen before, and the taking the pan, and the davening, and the other davenings, and the tkiyas, and everything is here. We have to accept it and take it, especially in this year of Hakel, where not only is Hakel for the community and for the family and for the world, but it's also for ourselves. We have to, as we say, get a grip. We have to take our own faculties and our own koiches, our own potential, all of it together, and just gather it in gathering of strength, and let it be an impetus to thrust us forward, to come closer to God, like it says in this week's parsha, L'man yishmeru, l'man yilmedu, to study, to hear, to learn, and to come closer. V'yoros Hashem, you come to true Yireh Shamayim. So we said we're going to speak a little bit about Tishrei, and everything in Tishrei is included, but we'll just maybe talk a little bit about Aseret Mechuvah and Yom Kippur, and at least the basics. So Tzom Gedalia is the day after, and at Tzom Gedalia the Rebbe would also come to this, in the years when he didn't daven with the minyan, like I mentioned earlier, he would come in before Slichas, and the Rebbe would say Slichas with the Olam, and stay on from Kriyas Avinu Malkeinu and Kriyas HaTorah, and then he would leave after that. At Mincha, after Mincha, the Rebbe would say a sicha called Divrei Kivushim, words of encouragement, words of Kivushim could also be translated not as rebuke, but as serious words of encouragement. Let's just say it that way. And then Sayis Meitshuva, the Rebbe also would always daven for the Yomid, would leave the prayers on Vav Tishrei, the Yortzeit of the Holy Rebbe Tzimchana, his mother, and the Rebbe would fabring, and when it was the weekday, he would also have a hadrin, special. He would finish Masechta, start a Masechta, etc. at the fabrengen, and it was also a very special time. Also, the Rebbe always had a fund named for his mother. Many people would also, in those days, sometimes they would contribute to our own school here called Beis Chana, which is named for the Rebbe's mother. And the Rebbe gave the name on his mother's 10th yahrzeit. Very interesting story, very famous story. But the Rebbe said then a hadron. The Rebbe spoke about the end of Sukkah, of Masechta Sukkah. The Rebbe was crying by the Farbrengen. Spoke about how one Jewish woman who unfortunately married a Greek soldier, and when the Greeks came in to the Heichal, the Rebbe was speaking about what it says in the end of Masechta Sukkah, that there were 24 families of Kohanim, but one family had a punishment, and it had several things. Their locker didn't open, and it says also they had a ring where they used to keep the head of the cow for the shechita there. That didn't open, so they had to always borrow and use from a different family. Bilga, it was called. And the Rebbe said the reason for that was that they had somebody from their family went off and married a Greek, and when she came in, she took off her shoe and she slapped the mizbeach, and she called it a wolf in Greek, which is lukus, and she said, "Till when are you going to take the money," meaning the karbonis, eat the money of the Jewish people and not save them? And the Rebbe said how this, even though she had went so far, but it bothered her that they were now being chased out of the Beis Hamikdash by the Greeks. This was in the story of Hanukkah, and at that time, so the Rebbe spoke about this. The Rebbe spoke about this story on that day. What people don't know is that the Rebbe was crying. The Rebbe said how our Jewish woman, even no matter where she has gotten to, can come closer to Yiddishkeit, learned the whole lesson from that. But on that very day, the Rebbe also gave we had this school already it was already running for a few years, but that day the Rebbe gave us the name for his mother, a school for women to come closer to Yiddishkeit. That was the station identification, right? No appeals today. So, nevertheless, Vav Tishrei is tomorrow night. Then we come to Erev Yom Kippur, and again, like I mentioned,